My name is Kim Do, and this is the final presentation for RIP 4's Seasonal Fun project. So to give a short introduction, my name is Kim Do. I'm currently living in Omaha, and I am in a dual MBA MSBA program.
Hello, my name is Dylan Delgado. I am living in San Antonio, Texas, and I am in the Masters of Analytics.
Hi, I'm Matt Mayer, and I'm currently living in Omaha, Nebraska, and I'm enrolled in the MBA program.
Hi, my name is Pulkit Upadhyay, and I'm currently in Omaha. I'm in the dual master's program of MBA and MSBIA.
Hi, my name is Ray Wu, and I'm currently living in Kansas City, and I'm majoring in dual MBA and BIA program.
I'm Will Duquette. I am based in Fargo, North Dakota, currently wrapping up the MBA program with Creighton.
Focus on the movement data. This data was collected from tracking the location and check-in for people around the park matched to a unique visitor ID. The first part of this mini challenge was to find groups of visitors in the data. We found several different groups and named them according to their behavior. For example, we found scary cat are people who never check in at a thrill ride. Early riser are people who came to the park at exactly at 8 a.m. and frequent flyer who make multiple check-ins on all 3 days of the weekend. The next part of this mini challenge was to find patterns in the data. We found a few interesting patterns, like that thrill rides were the most visited attractions and that Sunday was the day with the most movement in the park. The last part was to find anomaly. Some of these were 31 visitors who check in at the entrance but never check at any other attraction. Movement spike around 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. every day, and nobody check in into Creighton Pavilion after 12 p.m. on Sunday. These spike were likely for people going to Scott Jones' show, and having no check-in afternoon on Sunday was likely because of the vandalism. For mini challenge 1, there were other work that we had to do before making visualization and some challenges. The first thing we did was map the XY coordinate in the data to a map of the park to more accurately display where each movement was. We also make a coordinate table to associate the coordinates with an attraction. We also created calculated view for better analysis. The biggest challenge we faced with the analysis of this data was the size of the data set. Even relative simple action in Tableau had long loading time. Now I'm gonna pass over to Dylan.
As we look at our movement data, we identify different patterns. So this first visual is a background map with the heat map of the location where people traveled. And as we can see that there's a pretty consistent pattern despite the different 3 days of people making a lot of movement here on the left side of the screen, close to items number 31, 21, all the way down this path. So this shows us that even though we have different people on different days, we have a very consistent pattern where people visit probably the most popular attractions. The next story point illustrates a different cluster of how people traveled and the count of traveled and the check-in count. So we created a cluster with 4 different fields, 4 different clusters, and they vary in size. So you can see Friday, we have a more wide disparity. Saturday, we get closer together, and Sunday, it kind of moves a little bit, spreads out a little bit for the bottom 2 clusters. This was just a way to track movement count. On the next pattern, we identified the count of movements per minute of each day. And so very quickly, we can see spikes each day, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, around 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock for each different day. Saturday has the biggest spike, but there are still similar patterns on each of the 3 days. The next story point illustrates the movement volume by hour. We color coded it to identify each day, and we added a median, so we see the median amount of time that people were moving. We obviously noticed that Friday, people did not move nearly as much as they did Saturday and Sunday. and that Sunday still had a very, very large amount of movement throughout the day, with each day having a steady drop off towards the end of park closing time. The next story point shows the different check-in locations by their rides and the total amount. So we sorted them by the most that the check-ins. So as we can see, the Kamala's Big Spin and the Flight of the Swing-A-Don had the most check-in counts throughout the weekend. Next slide illustrates the location type and the average check-in per visitor. So we color-coded each location type. As we can see, different patterns emerge. Typically, the location types kind of cluster together, but we notice that thrill rides have the largest cluster. They have each thrill ride has an average check-in per visitor over 2, which is the most out of any cluster of location type on the graph. So the first major anomaly that we discovered was that we had no check-ins at Creighton Pavilion after noon on Sunday, which in our initial analysis gave us pause as to maybe this is where a crime took place or some interesting activity was going on. And our second anomaly that we discovered is we looked at the different times where we believe Scott Jones was speaking, and we looked at the movement in that, and we noticed that Sunday has a very, very different pattern than Friday and Saturday, giving us a pause that there is some interesting data going on in this moment.
Dylan. So for the first objective of mini challenge 2, we looked for high volume communications in the communication data. And we noticed 2 visitor IDs had a much higher volume of communication than others. These IDs had about 91,000 and 61,000 distinct communications respectively, compared to the next highest non-external source with just over 3,000. Based on the location and target data for these sources, we conclude that these are likely automated systems in the park for sending mass messages. For the second objective, we look for communication patterns. From a high-level view of the communication data, we noticed that the communication counts mirrored the movement across the 3-day period, increasing in volume from one day to the next. Using various line graphs, we discovered other patterns involving relationships between the locations where the communications occurred, as well as the trends of visitors communicating with external targets. It was discovered that shortly before noon on Sunday, there was a spike in communication in the wetlands and significant spikes in communication with external targets. In addition, one of the automated systems in the park experienced a large spike at noon on Sunday, whereas it was flat the rest of the weekend. These patterns lead us to believe that this is relevant to the crime at hand. And as discovered in Mini Challenge 1, this pattern lines up with the fact that there weren't any check-ins at Creighton Pavilion after noon on Sunday. The third objective was our hypothesis at that point in time. Based on the information we had, we determined 2 vandalism hypotheses. The first one we discovered was by analyzing the source and target communication volume using a bar chart to distinguish the highest volume communicators. Given the fact that there were large spikes in communication around noon, especially external, the fact that there were no check-ins after 12 p.m. at Creighton Pavilion on Sunday, we could narrow our search to Creighton Pavilion Sunday morning. We discovered that 5 visitors had very large amounts of messages in a span of 10 to 20 minutes, possibly coordinating vandalism. For the second hypothesis, we examined visitors' movement patterns, and we found 3 visitors with the same check-in movement patterns on Sunday morning. Thus, we could assume they were suspects as well. We discussed our challenges. The first challenge we had was that the communication data was less rich than the movement data. It had broad locations for data that made it a challenge to narrow down locations. The second challenge was how best to leverage calculated fields. And the third was to determine the best ways to slice communication to find patterns and anomalies, which one workaround was making source target combinations. And so I'll pass it on to Will to discuss the visualizations.
All right, as we look at the Mini Challenge 2 visuals, we work to understand the communication patterns throughout. The first pattern that we started to look at was understanding these combinations of both source and target and counting both. And so this graph is a scatter plot that has on the x-axis the distinct count of target, and on the y-axis the distinct count of source. As we look in the upper kind of right quadrant here, we see something that aligns to a lot of what we've seen in other data points, which is ultimately this large spike in communication around noon on Sunday, which further corroborates our thinking that something interesting happened around then. In the next graph, we look at basically pairs of communication in terms of both source and target pairs. And as we work through the days, you'll notice that on Friday and Saturday, and then up to Sunday, you see a growing size in terms of the number of pairs, which aligns to the movement data as we saw movement increase over the 3 days. Interestingly, on Sunday, you'll notice these much larger squares that are on the edge, which indicate larger amount of communication, but you'll notice by the lighter color that they actually have a lower amount of movement, which is an interesting anomaly that we also noticed. In the next visual, this is again just really reaffirming what we saw around communication patterns over the course of the weekend, where we see these spikes in communication on Friday and Saturday around that 11 and 4 p.m. time frame. But then Sunday, we do see this similar spike at 11, followed by really no spike in the afternoon. But there is this massive spike we see here in external communication that happens on Sunday, where we certainly don't see that over the course of the rest of the weekend. Additionally, we did look at it another way as we think about communication patterns. This is a different visual that we use to look at communication patterns across the weekend, where this blue line, which represents external communication, is pretty consistently flat across both Friday and Saturday. But we do see a pretty large spike on Sunday with a small aftershock as well, correlating around to that time where we believe that a crime may have occurred. As we look at the next visual, as we continue to think about the crime and where it occurred, this bright green line here is basically the check-ins that we see over the weekend at the Creighton Pavilion, where you'll see both Friday and Saturday, we have pretty consistent check-ins throughout the day. But again, as we've noted, on Sunday, there's an abrupt stop that happens right around noon. And so for this, I'm going to hand it over to Ray as we talk about the grand challenge and the crime itself to finish out the rest of that discussion.
For the grand challenge, we struggled a little bit on the grand challenge, but finally they all worked out. Diving into the challenge, we looked at issues at the park. One of the larger ones we found was related to spikes in check-ins to Ligament Fix Me Up station over the weekend. We have found 3 significant spikes over the 3-day period in indicating possible large-scale injuries, which seems unusual for standard amusement park. The largest spike by far was around 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. on Friday, with 30 or more check-ins than any other hour throughout the weekend. Looking at the activity of that specific injured group, it appears that a large majority of the group attended the Firefall attraction at 12 p.m. and there was a significant dip in the Firefall activity after 1 p.m., perhaps an accident involving the ride. Then we returned to the vandalism crime. Since there were no check-ins at Creighton Pavilion after 12 p.m. on Sunday and other movement patterns as Dylan addressed, we could confirm that the crime happened in Creighton Pavilion between 9:30 a.m. to 1:30 and 11:30 a.m. In order to find the suspects, we first create a visual that returns all visitor IDs with the highest check-ins at Creighton Pavilion. We also discovered that 3 visitors have the same check-ins on Sunday. Secondly, we have explored their communication data, and we noticed that these 3 people don't have communication data at the shows and entertainment area from 9:15 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. and 10:20 a.m. to 11 a.m. Then we tracked their movement data at park and found that they also have the same movement patterns, which also had no movement after Scott Jones' appearance. Also, when tracking our 3 suspects' movement, we noticed that all 3 of them are heavily trafficked area near the suspected location of vandalism on Sunday during the time of the suspected crime. According to their same check-ins patterns, disappearances from the map, and no communication data during that time, we assume these 3 visitors might be the suspect. Now, it's difficult to join or unionize the movement with the communication data sets, but we finally found a way out to identify key suspects and their movement and communication issues, and to see where Scott Jones went and spent his time with. I'll pass Scott Jones' movement to over the weekend over to PK.
Thank you, Ray. So as we look at our visualization story, for finding the issues at the park, we took the total count of movement at every place on all 3 days at all the times. And on the next page of this story, we look at Scott Jones's movement. By looking at the data and analyzing, we found out that he had 2 stage shows which were being held at Grinosaurus stage at 9:30 and 2:30. Scott Jones is not a paying customer, and thus he does not have a visitor ID. Since we know that he makes an appearance at the Grinosaurus stage, we looked at the most number of check-ins at the Grinosaurus stage, and we found out that there were 8 visitor IDs which had the same number of check-ins at the stage on all the 3 days. So we assume that these people are his friends or his security, and we also found out that these IDs had the same entry and exit from the right entrance of the park at twice a day, every day. For his first show, he first enters the park at 8:45 and exits at 12:15. We found out that he goes through each of the sections of the park to reach his destination, which takes him almost 45 minutes of time. He follows the same route for his exit, and for his second show, he follows the same process. On the next page of the story, we look at the similar. We find out that there's a similar spike in the communication count of all the 3 suspects at the same time. And on the final page of the story, we found out that the movement of the suspicious visitors, and they follow the same path in movement. With all the data analysis that we did, we have found out that the movement patterns in general were pretty consistent throughout all 3 days, even with a large number of visitors in the park, where the thrill rides were the most popular among all, with an average of over 2 visits per visitor. From our findings, we believe that the crime took place at the Creighton Pavilion shortly before noon, where some of Scott Jones's irreplaceable items were stolen, along with his Olympic medal. He is also what we call a creature of habit, since he follows a similar movement pattern every single day when he visits the park. And as we found out, there are 3 visitors that have a really suspectful movement pattern and communication pattern with each other. So we think that these are the 3 people who have organized the crime. Thank you.